Judges 15, and if you follow along, I'm going to read all of Judges 15, and then we'll come back and make some applicational thoughts along the way. Judges 15, verse number 1. But it came to pass, within a while after the time of the wheat harvest, that Samson visited his wife with a kid. That is a goat, not an Samson didn't show up with a baby, but with a kid, with a goat. And he said, I will go in to to my wife, into the chamber, but her father would not suffer him to go in. And her father said, I verily thought that thou hadst utterly hated her. Therefore, I gave her to thy companion. Is not her younger sister fairer than she? Take her, I pray thee, instead of her. And Samson said concerning them, Now shall I be more blameless than the Philistines, though I do them a displeasure. Samson went and caught 300 foxes, and took firebrands, and turned tail to tail. He tied tail to tail, and put a firebrand in the midst between the two tails. And when he had set the brands on fire, he let them go into the standing corn of the Philistines, or the standing grain of the Philistines. It would have been wheat. And burnt up both the shocks, and also the standing corn, with the vineyards and olives. Then the Philistines said, Who hath done this? And they answered, Samson, the son-in-law of the Timnite, because he has taken his wife and given her to his companion. And the Philistines came up and burnt her and her father with fire. And Samson said unto them, Though ye have done this, yet will I be avenged of you. After that I will cease. And he smote them hip and thigh with a great slaughter, and he went down and dwelt in the top of the rock Catatonk. Then the Philistines went up and pitched in Judah, and spread themselves in Lehi. And the men of Judah said, Why are you come up against us? And they answered, To bind Samson are we come up, to do to him as he hath done to us. Then 3,000 men of Judah went to the top of the rock Catatonk, and said to Samson, Knowest thou not that the Philistines are rulers over us? What is this that thou hast done unto them? And he said unto them, As they did unto me, so have I done unto them. And they said unto him, We are come down to bind thee, that we may deliver thee into the hand of the Philistines. And Samson said unto them, Swear unto me that ye will not fall upon me yourselves. And they spake unto him, saying, No, but we will bind thee fast, and deliver thee into their hand, but surely we will not kill thee. They bound him with 2 new cords, and brought him up from the rock. When he came unto Lehi, the Philistines shouted against him, and the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon him. The cords that were upon his arms became as flax that was burnt with fire, and his bands loosed from off his hands. And he found a new jawbone of an ass, and put forth his hand, and took it, and slew 1,000 men therewith. And Samson said, With the jawbone of an ass, heaps upon heaps, with the jawbone of an ass have I slain 1,000 men. It came to pass, when he had made an end of speaking, that he cast away the jawbone out of his hand, and called that place Ramath Lehi. And he was sore athirst, and called on the Lord, and said, Thou hast given this great deliverance into the hand of thy servant, and now shall I die for thirst, and fall into the hand of the uncircumcised? But God clave a hollow place that was in the jaw, and there came water out thereof, and when he had drunk, his spirit came again, and he revived. Wherefore he called the name thereof En-Hakkore, which is in Lehi unto this day. And he judged Israel in the days of the Philistines 20 years. We enter Judges 15 with the maybe the strangest of stories, or a very strange story, in that Samson is on his way down to visit his wife. Samson does not live with his wife, he's just going to visit his wife. Now, why this is the curious question, and there's some potential options put forth, one of which is this, and I would maybe lean this direction, and that is, with the Philistines and the Israelites intermarrying with one another, when an Israelite man and a Philistine woman got married, the woman would not go live with the man. Instead, she would stay at her father's house, and the husband could come down and visit her as often as he wanted, technically, but she stayed at her father's house. And he would come down and visit her, and we got to ask, why did they do this? And the likely reason for why this was done is that the Philistines used this as a way to maintain control over the Israelite men. The the Philistines had been in charge for 20-something years now. And they knew those Israelite men really want to have our Philistine women, but we have a power over them. They can have what they want, but we're going to keep them too. Thus, the father-in-law held his wife in her room and only allowed the husband in if he brought a goat and paid to go see his wife. Now, I know that's really strange, weird. Obviously, we don't do things like that today, but when Samson went down to partake in this custom that had become customary, he ran into a problem. His father-in-law would not let him enter his wife's room. The reason for that is his father-in-law had viewed Samson's actions at the end of chapter 14 as hatred. He's like, well, I mean, we had the whole 7-day wedding feast, and then you found out that she betrayed you, and they had been threatening her, and you found out all this stuff, and you went down and killed 30 Philistines, paid off the bribe from the promise of the riddle, and then you went back home. So, I mean, we don't know how long time has passed, but it came to pass a while. It's been a good time period between the two events. And so the father-in-law naturally came to this conclusion. He must have hated her. He must hate her for what took place. He must not be interested in his wife at all. And so he says to Samson, I gave her to your companion. I gave her to one of the best men that was given to you. Now, when we come down to verse 6, they answer who has done this with the son-in-law of the Timnite, indicating though she had been given to another man, Samson was still regarded as her husband by the Philistine people, indicating probably the second marriage hadn't happened yet. They hadn't had that feast marriage yet. And that makes sense considering she's also still living with her husband, or with her father. If she had married another Philistine, she would have gone to live with the Philistine. So it's a weird situation, and to compound all that, what's the father-in-law say? I mean, take your younger sister. She's prettier. She looks better than the one you married. I mean, I'll give her to you. It's almost like Samson didn't even hear that. And the reason for that is because Samson's judgment was clouded. Samson was seeing something else. And in verse 3, Samson says these words, now shall I be more blameless than the Philistines, though I do them a displeasure. In other words, Samson is well aware that some of the actions he had taken back in chapter 14 were not blameless. Now he's going to be blameless. Before, it was kind of a gray area. Now he says, I'm going to be blameless for what I'm about to do because of this situation. He feels justified. It's also interesting to note in verse 3, the way he words it, is that Samson did not view this as an issue between he and his father-in-law. This wasn't Samson and his father-in-law against one another. He won't give me my wife. I'm going to go take my wife. That's not at all how Samson's viewing this. Samson views this as that is all the Philistine people, and I am against them. They are against me. This is a national issue, not a personal issue. And Samson decides, I'm going to take matters into my own hands. I wanted her. I married her. Though I left her, I want her now. And because they wronged me, I'm going to do whatever I need to do to enact punishment on them. And I will be justified. Now, we understand as we read in verse 1 that it was the time of the wheat harvest. This would have been about the month of May during their years there. And Samson's vengeance, his punishment on the Philistines is what? obviously he had thought about this. This wasn't just a spur-of-the-moment thing. He goes out and catches 300 foxes, maybe jackals even, ties them tail to tail with a torch in between, sets the torch on fire, sends them out into the fields, the standing grain, which would have been the wheat. He sends them also into the shocks. The shocks would have been the piles of wheat and barley that had already been harvested but not processed. And not only that, he sends them out into the vineyards, the grapes. And he sends them out into the olive groves, the oil presses. And when all is said and done, the Philistine people are left with barely any wheat. Everything's burnt up. All their money, they're a highly agricultural society. All their money, all their livelihood is gone. And Samson took it all. And so we ask this question then. Looking at how Samson was wronged, looking at what Samson does in response, was Samson justified? Was Samson justified? No, don't worry. I know he felt justified in doing what he did, but was he justified? I don't believe so. In fact, I think by looking at this portion, in doing this, in taking vengeance on his own shoulders because of how he'd been wronged, I believe we begin to see this truth within this passage. If you do not deal with anger, anger will deal with you. If you don't deal with anger, anger will deal with you. Recall, again, back to the end of chapter 14. Samson kills 30 men to uphold the promise of what he said he would pay. Then according to verse 19, he goes to his father's house and his anger was aroused. In other words, he is getting angry at the situation after he's done all this. Now he's angry. But then a time period passes between chapter 14 and chapter 15, and here we learn something very, very crucial. Time may soften the outward appearance of anger. Time may even cool the internal raging of anger, but time is not the solution to anger. Anger remains. I doubt when Samson got down to his father-in-law's house, he was fuming and furious and, screaming, stomping, yelling, and throwing everything everywhere, demanding to see his wife. No, he probably showed up in a pretty decent demeanor. A nice, cordial guy. He's got the goat with him that he was supposed to bring. But at the slightest hint of being wronged, Samson's anger wells up inside of him, and it bursts forth, and as anger does, anger seeks vengeance. Anger says, I've been wronged and I'm going to do whatever I have to do to make it right in my own eyes, if you will. And so Samson thinks, I will be blameless. I'm seeing this clearly as it's supposed to be. And the evidence of anger is this. It makes you think you're thinking clearly and you're seeing clearly when your judgment's fully clouded over. And you have no idea what is true. And anger tells you, the dirty secret of anger, it says you are blameless no matter what you do to get even. And that's just wrong. Now, before we continue the story of Samson, I want to pause for a moment. And I want to take us on a little excursus regarding anger, and then we'll come back to the story of Samson. If you read Moses' song to the children of Israel, Deuteronomy, he records how God responded to him, how God responded to Moses, when Moses responded to the Israelite people abandoning God for foreign gods. You might recall the story, having read it, how Moses was furious and angry, and he wanted to avenge God, and God said to Moses what? Vengeance is mine. This is not for you to do, Moses. I will avenge myself. Now, how can God be vengeful? and angry without going overboard. I know, you probably are aware, when we're angry, when we're vengeful, we often go a little bit farther than we're supposed to go. Sorry, not supposed to. We go way farther than we ever should go, generally speaking. But Moses actually revealed something about God's character just a few verses back in chapter 32, verse 4. He said this about God: He is the rock. His way is perfect. For all his ways are justice, a God of truth and without injustice, righteous and upright is he. In other words, Moses says, this is the character of God, and because this is God's character, he can enact vengeance properly, righteously, rightly, without going overboard. God is the embodiment of justice and truth, and he can perfectly balance both mercy and justice, both his anger and the vengeance necessary in response to that anger. God can balance it without sinning. And that's the difficult part of us, is trying to balance it without sinning. Now that teaching about vengeance being his is upheld later. Remember, we read Romans 12, verse 19. Beloved, do not avenge yourselves, but rather give place to wrath. In other words, put wrath and vengeance in their rightful place. Put it where it goes. That's what you're supposed to do with wrath and vengeance. Put them in their proper place. What is that proper place? It says there, for it is written, vengeance is mine. I will repay, says the Lord. So, why do I go down that road? Because when we know the truth about vengeance, I believe that helps us dealing with our anger. When we know that we are not to avenge, when we know that we can take vengeance and just put it on God's plate, set it aside. We don't need to seek vengeance. We don't need to seek the retribution. God can handle all of that because God is perfect and he is just and he is holy and he is righteous. Because he can handle all that, I don't need to worry about vengeance. What do I need to do? I need to worry about dealing with my anger. How do we deal with our anger? Ephesians 4:31 says this: Let all bitterness, wrath, anger, clamor, and evil speaking be put away from you with all malice. And, in other words, in response, be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, even as God, in Christ, forgave you. I've heard it said before, and I believe it bears out. It's really hard to be angry with someone, to be wrathful and vengeful and speaking evil of someone. It's really hard to speak evil of someone when they're constantly being nice to you and being kind to you and doing kind things for you and with you and by you. It's really hard to be angry at those kind of people. When they're tender-hearted, when they're soft towards you, and the soft answer turneth away wrath. Furthermore, I think it's nearly impossible. It's nearly impossible to harbor anger in your heart towards someone when you stop for just a moment and forgive them because of how God forgave you. When you are actively in the process of looking at someone and you look at them and you say, I forgive you, it's hard to be angry with them. When you look at them and look at them in this light, I did all of these things to dishonor and disobey and snub my nose at the God of the universe. I broke God's law so heavily, and God looked at Christ and said, I'll release you from your debt, and now I got to look at someone else and be angry at them. It's really hard to be angry at someone when you look at how God did everything, all this for you. Really hard. So, now I know this is not going to be the end-all, be-all for how to deal with anger. We could go down that rabbit hole for a long time, probably, according to the Bible. But maybe this is a simplified version of how to deal with anger. Let's put it that way. We are to be actively kind one to another. Soft-hearted toward who people are, where they are, how they are. We are to be forgiving them. We are to be releasing them from the debt. Oh, sure, they might owe you because they wronged you. But what should we do? Let go. We don't have to seek retribution. We don't have to seek it back. God's got that. Which, practically speaking, might have this implication. It might mean you got to give yourself up. If you've been angry towards someone, you might have to reveal that you were angry at them. Now, you might not have to say the actual words, "I was angry with you," but it might be that they will come away from this message and they'll notice a change in you and how you start being kind to them, and how you start being tenderhearted to them, and how you start forgiving them like God forgave you because of Christ. And it's possible you'll have to reveal your cards because of that. See, as much as anger likes to hide in the shadows and present itself to our hearts and tell us, "Oh, don't worry, anger is a private sin. It's an internal sin. It's not anything out external." The reality is the only way to deal with anger is to get anger out in the light. And that's really all sin. The only way to deal with any sin, because sin always tries to tell you it's a personal thing, it's a private thing, nobody else needs to know. The only way to get it out is to bring it out into the light and shine the light on it. Why? Because if you don't deal with anger, anger is going to deal with you. Samson did not deal with his anger. And so when we return back now to Judges chapter 15, and as we continue to look throughout this chapter, what we find is anger dealing with Samson because he didn't deal with it in the first place. And so number 2, consider this thought. Anger leads to vengeance, which leads to horrifying inhumanity, which leads to fear and hiding. Anger leads to vengeance, which leads to horrifying inhumanity, which leads to fear and hiding. In response to Samson's vengeance, the Philistines get revenge. And look at how this story goes. Samson, upset, "I've been wrong, I'll be blameless for what I'm about to do to you." He goes out and burns down all their crops, and they come back to Samson and say, "Oh, 2 can play that game." And what do? They go kill his wife and his father-in-law. They burn them with fire. "You burned our crops? Fine. We burned your wife and father-in-law." How about that? Then what happens? Samson goes and it says he hip and thigh with a great slaughter is how he attacks these Philistines. The meaning of that term is this: unrestrained cruelty. Samson, in other words, he saw red and he went off, horrified, killing Philistines left and right, raging until he was done. And we're not told how many Philistines he killed in this great slaughter. I would imagine it was more than just 1 or 2. And Samson's failure to deal with his anger leads him down the path of revenge, which only results in what? More unjust, barbaric atrocities. You see how the ball rolls? You did this, I'm going to get even, I'm going to get even, I'm going to get even. And it just back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And eventually somebody's got to get off the train, or get run over by the train, I guess maybe is one way you could put it. And Samson says, I'm going to do this and then I'm going to be done. And to his credit, he quits. But it's interesting what he does in quitting. He runs away. He goes and he hides in the cleft of the rock, the top of the rock of a tom. This is, in other words, hiding. Samson goes and hides in these rocks. Like an animal would hide among the rocks from the birds of prey seeking to devour them. This is what Samson does. He's a fugitive now. He's a loner. He doesn't go back to his father's. He's running afraid for his life. How do I know he's afraid for his life? Look at how he responds to the men of Judah and how the men of Judah respond to the Philistines. The Philistines come up against the men of Judah and they think, oh, they're here for us. And of course the men of Judah go out, wait, whoa, why are you coming against us? And the Philistines say, no, we've come for Samson. And look at what the men of Judah do. They say, okay, great, we'll go get him for you. 3,000 men of Judah say, we'll go get Samson and bring him to the Philistines. Did no one standing up for their own countryman? Now, don't get me wrong. I wouldn't stand up for what Samson had done either. But he's still my countryman. Instead, they say, no, we'll go get Samson. We'll deliver him up to you. You want to know what happens if you don't deal with anger? It leads to you constantly looking over your shoulder, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Because when you least expect it, boom, something's going to get you. What goes around is going to come around sooner or later. And if you don't deal with anger, it's going to get you at some point. Just a matter of when. And like Samson, that leads to cowering and fear and hiding away, to isolation. And that leads to paranoia. Because look at what happens when the men of Judah arrive. Samson's no longer concerned and worried about falling into the hand of the Philistines. He knows he justly deserves to fall into the hand of the Philistines because of all the ones he killed. But what's he worried about? He's not worried about the Philistines. He's worried about this. Promise me that you will not kill me. Swear to me that you won't fall on me and kill me. Absolutely wild turn of events. Maybe I can put it this way. Anger is like a cancerous tumor. Unless you deal with it when it is small, it's going to grow and grow and grow and grow. And eventually it will disfigure you, and eventually when it's done with you, it will leave you a shell of a person of who you used to be, if you don't take care of it at the beginning. Hence why it's so necessary that we what? Catch cancer before it gets to stage 4, but because generally speaking, by the time cancer gets to stage 4, what? It's too late. That's kind of like anger. Samson has let it grow and grow and grow, and he's now disfigured, and he has no idea what's actually... He's worried they're going to kill him. He's paranoid. Surely the Philistines are going to kill him. Well, what do I do here? And only upon their assurances that they will not kill him does he turn himself over to the Philistines. And I want you to imagine just for a moment the despair that must have fallen upon Samson's spirit when the men of Judah took him, bound him up, handcuffed him, and led him to the camp of the Philistines, which was shouting against him. In other words, they're jeering and excited because they've been waiting for this moment that now they get to inflict upon Samson all the horrors they've been dreaming of because of what Samson did to them. Because he refused to deal with his anger has dealt with him. There's a saying, sooner or later, the chickens come home to roost. Another saying, sooner or later, you have to face the music. That's where Samson is. Sooner or later, your anger will be dealt with. You either get to deal with it at stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, or it's going to deal with you. Now, I know, you and I both know, this is not the end of the story. And so consider this thought. At the end of anger's ropes awaits a long-suffering God who can provide deliverance. At the end of anger's ropes awaits a long-suffering God who can provide deliverance. These people are all well aware, Samson himself, the men of Judah, the Philistines, they're all aware of the superhuman strength that Samson has, but I believe it is highly unlikely at this moment that Samson has any confidence he can do anything in this situation. It appears, based on how Samson responds, he has resigned himself to die in the hands of the Philistines at this moment. Because that's what sin ultimately does. Sin ultimately causes us and leads us to trade our strength in for weakness. And we'll discover a little bit more on that next week when we deal with Samson and Delilah. But on top of, I don't believe Samson had confidence to think he could do anything about this situation, I also don't think Samson expected God was going to do anything in this situation. I mean, why would God do anything in this situation? And actually, maybe more honestly, why would Samson have any thoughts of God at this moment anyway? At every turn, Samson has done whatever Samson wants to do. What's God got to do with this? This is Samson's bed. Now he's got to lie in it. Look at the royal mess that Samson has made in Judges chapter 15, at the end of 14 too, if you want to include all that in there too. Samson has made an absolute train wreck of a mess. Why on earth would God step in and save Samson? I don't think Samson was looking for either of those events. But the answer to that question is kind of this. Because that's what God does. That's what God does. God steps into a mess and delivers. That's God's nature. Samson, he was not done with. He had a plan for Samson. Samson had somewhere to be and something to do. And though Samson was sidetracked on his own thing, doing his own anger, vengeance deal, God still had a plan for Samson and wanted Samson to do something for 20 years to judge the Israelites. And so, God steps in. And the Spirit empowers Samson to break free from his ropes and to grab the fresh jawbone of a donkey. In other words, an animal that had recently died. It hadn't been sitting out in the sun, and the jawbone became dry and brittle and would have broken real quick. And obviously it was a full-strength bone. And he goes on to kill 1,000 Philistines and then judge Israel for 20 years. Now, some raise concern about whether or not this is a breaking of Samson's Nazirite vow. Obviously, we looked at it last week, that coming in contact with the carcass of the lion, it was sinful for Samson to do so, and all the problems there. And maybe at first it might seem as though Samson has broken his vow by doing this, but I don't believe that to be the case. Maybe we can have a longer discussion on it at some point in time, but I kind of view this situation a bit similar to the situation of David and his men. If you remember the story, David and his men were starving. And they go into the tabernacle and they eat the bread that was consecrated, that was dedicated only to the service of the tabernacle. It was not to be eaten for food and sustenance. And they went in and ate it, and everybody was up in arms about how could they do this thing, and what happened? God came along and said, no, they are justified in eating that bread. There was something that took a precedence over the consecration of that bread. And that was that they would live. They wouldn't die. That's one instance. Number two instance. Lying is a sin, yes? Most all of us would agree that you learned that as a kid. Lying is a sin. But is it ever justifiable to lie? I believe the answer borne out in Scripture would be yes, there is a justification for lying at times. Again, I know, that's a scary one to say out loud in church, oh no. But I believe the precedence of a greater sin at hand may lead to the justification of a lie. Now, of course, there's a lot of digging that has to be done before we're gonna answer that question, and we've been debating that forever. So I guess if you want to discuss that one later, we can have fun with that one. But those are just two examples I want to give you of things may not be exactly as they seem at the outset. Let's put it that way. I don't believe Samson was wrong to pick up the jawbone of a freshly dead animal to slay these Philistines, because the Spirit led him to that place to defeat them, and that was the thing that was given to him. That's what was there to defeat them. And in response to his great victory, Samson says this: with the jawbone of an ass, heaps upon heaps, with the jaw of an ass, have I slain 1,000 men. That word ass or donkey, the first word heaps in that sentence is actually the exact same word as the word donkey or ass there. The second word heap is a distinct word Very similar, but distinct. And it's an interesting phrase and meaning, and maybe, I apologize, I guess, if it's more crude than you would normally be comfortable with. But I already said lying wasn't a sin in every case in church, so I might as well jump down this road too. The meaning of that statement is this. With the jawbone of an ass, I've made a pile of asses. That's what Samson's getting across. Fairly crude. A lot like his comment back in chapter 14 when he said, unless you plow with my heifer, talking about his wife. It's a Hebraic pun insinuating those Philistines are about as good as a donkey. Stubborn, stupid, foolish, because I killed them with the jawbone of a donkey. It's an interesting story, to say the least. And to top it off, Samson calls this place Ramath Lehi, Jawbone Hill. Now the irony of this situation is, it's not a hill. It's a bowl-shaped valley. And the hill is the mountain of dead Philistines that he just killed. And then Samson goes on and he says what? Lord, you have given this great deliverance by the hand of your servant. What do we understand from this? At the end of anger's ropes, when Samson was being led to die because of his sinful choices regarding anger, Samson found what? There is a long-suffering God who will step into the mess that I have made, and he will provide a deliverance. This wasn't Samson's deliverance. This was God's deliverance. Now, I know chapter 15, I primarily dealt with anger, the cascading results of anger. But really, in this passage, anger could be simply emblematic of all sin in general. The cascading results of sin is what? Death. That's what sin leads to. Now, most of you probably already know where we're going with this, but the same God that stepped in and saved Samson at the end of anger's ropes is the same God that has already stepped into our mess, our sin, and at the end of sin's rope, death, he stepped in to save us from that. Why? Because that's what God does. That's who God is. That is God's character. He is, according to Psalms 86:15, a God full of compassion and gracious, long-suffering, and abundant in mercy and truth. That's just who he is. That is God's modus operandi, if you will. God stepped in by sending his own son to live the perfect life that we couldn't, to die the death that we shouldn't, or death he shouldn't. And as a result of his sinless death, death could not hold Jesus. Therefore, Jesus rose again back to life, never died again. And in Jesus' death, he paid the penalty for our sins. And in Jesus' resurrection, he gave us the opportunity, he gave us the life that we could never, ever live. That's the full display of God's love and his compassion and his grace toward us while we were yet sinners. And now you might say, wow, what a God. That God would step into the absolute worst of messes that I have ever created, in that for most of us, we snubbed our noses at God and we wanted to run away and go do our own thing, kind of like Samson, and we're just doing our own thing, and then God steps into our mess. Can it get any better than that? I submit that it can. Look at verse 18. And he, Samson, was sore athirst, and called on the Lord and said, Thou hast given this great deliverance into the hand of thy servant, and now shall I die for thirst, and fall into the hand of the uncircumcised. But God clave a hollow place that was in the jaw, and there came water out thereof, and when he had drunk, his spirit came again, and he revived, wherefore he called the name thereof En-Hakkore, which is in Lehi unto this day. There, at Jawbone Hill, the bowl-shaped valley, in the hollow place, in other words, in the center place of that valley, God split open the ground, and a spring rushed forth that many decades later when this was written was still producing water for those who were thirsty and in need. The name of that spring? En-Hakkore, the spring of the caller. Can it get any better than God stepping into our mess, sending his son to save us in the midst of our mess? Yes, it can get better. And the better news is this. When you call on him, he answers. When you ask for deliverance, he gives it. That's the better news. That he will save us. The way he worded it, the way Jesus worded it, to the woman outside the Samaritan city of Sychar at Jacob's well is this. Whoever drinks of this water will thirst again, but whoever drinks of the water that I shall give him will never thirst. But the water that I give him will become in him a fountain of water springing up into everlasting life. We learn a lot about anger from the story of Samson in Judges 15. We learn a lot there. And emblematic, of course, symbolic, I should say, of sin. We learn a lot. But the best news about the story of Samson is how God stepped into Samson's situation to save him. And when Samson called out to God, God answered. And we'll see that again in 2 weeks. Because Samson will stand between the pillars and he will call out to God one more time. And God will answer. The Spirit will answer. See, the glorious news of the story of Samson is that it reveals to us what? Though we're a mess, though we're flawed people, in all the garbage that we found ourselves in, if we call out for deliverance, we can have it. We can have deliverance from anger. We can have deliverance from sin. In fact, we could go down the line of things that aren't even anger or sin that God will deliver us from and help us in and step into the mess that we are in. The glorious news of the story of Samson reveals that the one who calls out for deliverance can have it. The question is, will we call out for deliverance? Let's pray, and then I'd like us to sing the song we sang last week. He is able to deliver.